So again, my name is Nick Legler, and I'm a fisheries biologist with the Wisconsin DNR in Sturgeon Bay. And today I'd like to present an update on the status of salmon and trout in Lake Michigan. And much of my presentation today will actually focus on Chinook salmon management, and particularly on some of the bigger management efforts or changes that have occurred for Chinook salmon during the last 5 years. And right up front, I would just like to acknowledge that several people and agencies from around the lake played a major role in pulling together a lot of the data and information for this talk today, and specifically the members of the Lake Michigan Salmonid Working Group. So a major goal of the Lake Michigan Salmonid Working Group is to work together to annually collect and analyze lake-wide data sets that can ultimately be given to the Lake Committee to help them with making management decisions, particularly for Chinook salmon stocking. And the method used by the Salmonid Working Group to conduct these evaluations was recently updated or revised. And my talk today will focus largely on the development of this new method called the predator-prey ratio analysis. I will also talk about the methods of this approach and give you an update on the 2015 results. So I'd also like to spend a little bit of time discussing Chinook salmon returns to our spawning weirs throughout the lake, with a focus on Strawberry Creek, and specifically how Strawberry Creek was previously used as an initial feedback indicator for the 2013 stocking reduction. And then lastly, I'd like to end with a brief discussion of fish community objectives. So from 2004 to 2011, the Salmonid Working Group used an approach called the red flags analysis. And this approach looked at about 15 individual data sets that were chosen specifically to represent 5 main categories of Lake Michigan's system: Chinook salmon abundance, recruitment, Chinook salmon growth, and also prey fish biomass and ecosystem health. And this approach looked at each of these individual data sets plotted separately through time, and trends in these individual data sets were evaluated closer using established percentiles. So if a data point fell either above or below the established percentiles, that essentially triggered a red flag. And there were 2 different levels or criteria that were used to trigger these red flags. The details of those criteria are listed here, but for today's talk, I'll just simply mention that if 50% of the red flags were triggered under either level 1 or level 2, that suggested that a potential problem may be occurring in the ecosystem or the fishery, and managers should possibly consider management actions to correct that problem. So a very detailed review of the red flags analysis was conducted in 2012, and it was apparent that there were several pros and cons to this approach. So the fact that the red flags used 15 individual data sets could be looked at as both a pro and a con. Certainly Lake Michigan is a very large dynamic system, so it's important to rely on several pieces of information to guide our decisions. But on the other hand, these data sets were somewhat time consuming, and the scope of the analysis became somewhat broad. So another drawback of the red flags analysis was that it used percentiles, which essentially looked at deviations from historic trends to guide our future management decisions. And certainly Lake Michigan is continuously changing, so it doesn't necessarily make sense to use these past trends to guide our future decisions. So with these things in mind, over the course of about 2 years, there were several meetings and workshops amongst anglers or amongst managers from throughout the lake, and ultimately a new approach called the predator-prey ratio analysis was developed. So this approach uses one primary indicator, which is total lake-wide Chinook salmon biomass divided by total lake-wide alewife biomass, plotted here as a simple ratio through time. And really the concept of this ratio is pretty simple. A high ratio suggests that the ecosystem is out of balance with a high biomass of predators relative to a low biomass of prey. way too many predators with not enough to eat. And a low biomass suggests that the ecosystem is out of balance with a relatively low biomass of predators and a large biomass of prey. So if we break the ratio apart and look at the two separate components, we have Chinook salmon biomass divided by alewife biomass, and each of these biomass estimates are calculated using a separate statistical catch-at-age model. The catch-at-age model specifically calculates abundance by age for each of these species, and those abundance estimates are then multiplied by average size at age to get the biomass estimates plotted here. And just kind of a really simple explanation of a catch-at-age model is that the model uses observed data to provide a most likely answer to a question. And in this particular case, our question is, how many Chinook salmon must have been present in Lake Michigan in order to produce the observed survey results? And several key pieces of information are included in the Chinook salmon catch-at-age model, including numbers of fish stocked. Currently, we use numbers of Chinook salmon stocked in Lake Michigan, and recently we've also included a percentage of Chinook salmon stocked in northern Lake Huron. And that's because we've found with tagging studies that there actually is a large proportion of Chinook salmon from northern Lake Huron that travel over into Lake Michigan. We also look at percent wild of the Chinook salmon fishery. This is based currently on the Great Lakes Mass Marking Program. This model incorporates numbers harvested and targeted effort from the angler surveys. And then we also look at age and maturity of the harvest and mean weights in the harvest. So the alewife catch-at-age model uses a similar approach. Information used for the alewife model includes alewife abundance estimates from the trawl and hydroacoustic surveys, alewife proportion by age from the trawl surveys, and the number of salmon and trout stocked. So certainly Lake Michigan is more complex than just Chinook salmon and alewife, and it's important to emphasize here that the alewife model does take into consideration estimated consumption on alewife by several salmonid species, not just by Chinook salmon. So in order to help interpret the predator-prey ratio, there's been set reference points that have been developed. So a target of 0.05 essentially serves as a management goal. That's a sustainable predator-prey balance that management or stocking levels should seek to achieve. And then we've also established an upper limit, which is essentially a situation that we would like to try to avoid because it's an unbalanced system with too many predators and there's potential risk of collapsing the fishery. So several different criteria were used to establish these reference points, including literature reviews, potential risk associated with collapsing the fishery, and then we also looked at comparisons with other lake ecosystems. So to provide a little bit of context, the Chinook salmon fishery in Lake Huron collapsed in 2006, and 5 years prior to that collapse, the predator-prey ratio in Lake Huron was estimated to be 0.11. So certainly that is a situation that we would like to avoid in Lake Michigan. And additionally, we've also incorporated a projection model that essentially uses average recruitment and survival from previous years to project what the future predator-prey ratio may be based on current stocking practices. So generally speaking, if a predator-prey ratio or a projection either approaches or exceeds the upper limit, that suggests that managers may want to consider stocking less salmon. If the ratio is well below the target, then possibly we might be able to stock more salmon. Certainly, if the ratio falls somewhere in between those upper limits, it remains somewhat subjective regarding what we should do with future stocking levels. So to provide some additional guidance on these stocking levels, we've established 6 auxiliary indicators. And these indicators were chosen specifically to look at Chinook salmon weight, Chinook fishing harvest and effort, and alewife age structure. These data sets will be looked at just as simple data sets plotted through time. We don't intend to use targets or limits or reference points with these data sets. So in order to understand how the predator-prey ratio analysis and the auxiliary indicators could be used together to help guide management decisions, a retrospective evaluation was conducted. And there were two components of this analysis. One retrospective simply plotted the predator-prey ratio and the projections for every year from 1990 to 2013 individually, so that we could see how the ratio and projections may change through time. And then a second, more focused retrospective looked at 3 recent stocking reduction situations in 1999, 2006, and 2013. And we essentially asked if the predator-prey ratio had been available at the time these stocking reductions were implemented, how would it have responded? And I don't have time today to show the information from these retrospectives, but I simply wanted to acknowledge that they were conducted, and generally the analysis supported these past stocking reduction decisions. So next, I would like to show some of the results from the predator-prey ratio analysis updated with data through 2015. So here you can see in 2015, the predator-prey ratio reached an all-time high of 0.108. And similarly, in 2013, the ratio was about 0.1. So really, in 2 of the past 3 years now, we've been either right at or above that established upper limit with the predator-prey ratio. And I'll just also point out that the light green dots that are shown on this data series simply indicate years that a decision was made to reduce Chinook salmon stocking. So again, if we break the ratio down into the 2 main components, we have Chinook salmon biomass and alewife biomass. And really over the last 10 to 15 years, Chinook salmon biomass has been pretty high in Lake Michigan. In the last 2 years, the Chinook salmon biomass in the lake has dropped, and particularly in 2015, the biomass of Chinook salmon in Lake Michigan is the lowest it's been since the mid-1970s. And several factors have likely caused this, one being the 2013 stocking reductions. The wild recruitment of Chinook salmon in 2013 was also low, so those fish would have been 2-year-olds this past year in 2015. And then certainly we've also seen lower body sizes of many Chinook salmon in Lake Michigan as well. So if we look at alewife biomass, you can see despite 3 recent stocking reductions of Chinook salmon, alewife biomass in Lake Michigan remains extremely low. And in 2015, it was the lowest number on record. And this is likely being driven by several factors, including top-down predation on the alewife base by Chinook salmon, but also by other predators like lake trout, steelhead, brown trout. And then certainly bottom-up effects of mussels are also playing a major role in this. So if we look at the projection moving forward from 2015, you can see that the projection does come down. That's encouraging. However, the projection itself still has a pretty sharp upward trajectory. And it's important to acknowledge that these projections are based on average recruitment and survival. And particularly for the alewife model, it looks at average recruitment and survival across the entire time series. So realistically, alewife recruitment tends to be quite variable. We have some years that are high, some years that are average, some years that are pretty poor. So in the model, it uses averages for the next 5 years. So it ends up being a pretty consistent average level of alewife recruitment. Now that's not necessarily realistic. So the green square or green figure in this graph shows kind of a hypothetical example. So essentially what I did to create this figure was I pulled 2 of the projections for alewife biomass in the next 5 years, and instead of having to be average, I made them well below average, and you can see that that caused the future projections to go up. So these projections are useful. They can help anticipate how current management strategies may affect the future predator-prey ratio, but it's important to acknowledge that these projections are based on averages. So next, I would like to share the auxiliary indicators updated with data through 2015. And staying on the topic of alewife, I will start with this indicator, which shows alewife numbers by age. So the red bars show the number of alewife in millions per year class, and you can generally see that the numbers are pretty low. The blue bars show the average numbers by year class for 2001 to 2005, just to provide a little bit of a past perspective. And just a general observation from recent alewife surveys is that we're seeing an alewife population that's somewhat truncated, dominated mostly by smaller, younger alewife, whereas we used to see age classes up to 8-9 years in the alewife population. So a second auxiliary indicator looks at catch per effort for the Lake Michigan charter boat fishery, and the top figure shows catch per hour separated out by each of the individual states, and then the bottom figure shows a combination of all those states' data together. Generally, catch per effort for the charter boat fishery has been pretty high during the past 10 to 15 years. 2012 was actually the third highest on record, and just behind 2006 and 2007, which were also very good years. However, in recent years, we've seen a decline in these catch per effort. 2013, 14, and 15 were all relatively low. Again, with the Chinook salmon stocking reductions and relatively poor 2013 year class, that would not have had any effect on this 2013 data point. It may have started to have some effect on 2014, and certainly in 2015, those 2013 year class of fish are now 2 years old, so those reductions are now starting to impact this fishery potentially. So this auxiliary indicator looks at the percent species composition of the sport harvest by weight, and just some general trends. You can see that throughout the time series, Chinook salmon have been a major component of the fishery, followed by lake trout, rainbow trout, coho, and a smaller percentage of brown trout. Just one general observation here is that it seems like when more lake trout are caught, you're seeing anglers catching less Chinook in terms of weight, and the opposite also holds true. So even in the recent year in 2005, you can see by weight there's slightly more lake trout harvested, but slightly less Chinook salmon harvested. And there's probably several reasons driving this, potentially competition between the two species. And I suspect that angler efforts are probably driving a lot of this too, because a lot of anglers tell me that when they're not able to catch Chinook salmon, they may switch tactics and start targeting lake trout. So probably two of the most important auxiliary indicators that we have look specifically at Chinook salmon weight and condition as a very good indicator of predator-prey balance. So the first one is the standard weight of a 35-inch Chinook salmon, and in 2015, our standard weight dropped to 16.3 pounds. Generally, there's been a downward trend in these standard weights through time, and 2 of the past 5 years have been below 16 pounds. And then we also look at the average weight of age 3 female Chinook salmon during the fall. And for this information, we use spawning weirs from Wisconsin and Michigan. And then we've also incorporated fall electrofishing surveys that Illinois DNR does in some of their harbors. So again, the top figure shows this average weight for all the different states separated. Generally, the trends have been pretty similar. And then the bottom figure shows all this information combined. And in 2015, our average rate dropped to 12.4 pounds. Generally, 11 of the past 12 years were below 15 pounds. So we've seen some pretty low sizes in the Chinook salmon at these facilities. So next, excuse me. Next, I'd like to take a closer look at the Strawberry Creek spawning facility in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. Strawberry Creek is Wisconsin DNR's primary egg collection facility for Chinook salmon. In most years, we'll collect 100% of the eggs that we need for hatchery production right from Strawberry Creek. And we've been able to maintain a pretty long-term data set at Strawberry Creek using known aged fish to look at size at age. And another interesting component of Strawberry Creek is that it's a relatively small stream. It's less than a half a mile from the weir to where Strawberry Creek dumps into Sturgeon Bay. And because it's a small stream, we actually have the ability to artificially supplement the flow. So we have a diesel pump that we run around the clock during the harvest, and that can really help to draw fish in, especially on years where water levels are low. So again, in 2013, a 50% lake-wide reduction in Chinook salmon stocking was implemented for Lake Michigan. And at this time, the Lake Michigan Committee had decided to use the weight of age 3 female Chinook salmon at Strawberry Creek as an immediate kind of feedback indicator on that stocking policy. And currently, we now have the predator-prey ratio analysis, and I think the predator-prey ratio is that better indicator now. But regardless, it can still be informative to look at this policy and what the results show. So specific details of this feedback indicator were to look at 3-year average weights, and if it was below 15 pounds, that would suggest possibly reducing stocking more. Above 19.8 pounds, suggested possibly we could increase stocking, and between suggested that we should pretty much just continue with our current status quo stocking policy. So in 2015, we sampled 329 age 3 female Chinook salmon. That's based on coated wire tag returns, and the average weight was 13.1 pounds. Our 3-year average for 2013 to 2015 was 16.3 pounds, so we're just above that 7 kilogram threshold, but regardless, 9 of the past 12 years, we've been below 15 pounds. So again, some pretty low Chinook salmon body weights. So if we take a quick look at numbers of fish returning to the Strawberry Creek weir, the general trend is we've seen fluctuations through time, and this is likely being driven by several factors. But I just want to point out that 2015 was particularly low. We had 1,869 Chinook, which was actually the second lowest on record. And there's actually only been 3 times throughout this time series where we've handled under 2,000 Chinook salmon at Strawberry Creek. So if we look at more of a lake-wide perspective at each of the different spawning weirs throughout the lake, you can see the trends are generally similar. And really in 2015, we had pretty low returns at all of the Chinook salmon spawning facilities. So a 6th auxiliary indicator specifically looks at fish community objectives, and unfortunately I didn't have time to get that indicator updated for today's presentation, but I would like to just share some more general information on fish community objectives. So for salmon and trout, our community objective is to establish a diverse salmoning community capable of sustaining an annual harvest of 6 to 15 million pounds, of which 20 to 25% is lake trout, and to establish a self-sustaining lake trout population. So this, I apologize, I'm just getting over a cold. This slide shows the total lake-wide harvest for all species combined with the 6 million and 15 million reference points. And over the last 5 years, we've been above 6 million pounds in 2011, 2012, and 2013. We've been below 6 million in 2014 and 2015. The 5-year average has been 7.2 million, so just above that 6 million threshold. So these red lines show 20 and 25% of the total harvest. So based on our lake trout objectives, the harvest of lake trout should fall between those two lines if we're meeting the objective. And you can see that from the late 80s to the late 90s, we were pretty much between those lines within that percentage. And in recent time, 2013 to 2015, we've also hit those percentages. So the diverse salmoning community is pretty general, but this slide simply shows that indeed we do have a pretty diverse fishery in the lake, comprised largely of Chinook, but also the other salmoning species. So this slide is very similar to the previous slide that I showed for an auxiliary indicator, but the auxiliary indicator specifically looked at sport harvest. This figure looks at total harvest throughout the lake by several methods, including survey and weir harvest. So just in summary, the predator-prey ratio analysis is a new and focused approach that's been designed specifically to look at predator-prey balance between Chinook salmon and alewife. The Salmonid Working Group plans to update this analysis on an annual basis and to provide this information to the Lake Committee to help guide future management decisions. Overall, in recent years, we've seen some pretty high Chinook salmon biomass estimates. However, in the last 2 years, it has come down. Alewife biomass continues to be low. The predator-prey ratio is high. It's been at or above our upper limit for 2 of the past 3 years. And we've seen some pretty low weights of Chinook salmon. So certainly Chinook salmon are a major component of Lake Michigan's fishery. I expect that Chinook salmon will continue to play an important role in the fishery, and certainly that's important for many anglers. However, it's important to acknowledge that Chinook salmon rely on alewife for food. And the future extent of the Chinook salmon fishery will really depend on the future extent of the alewife population, and there remains a lot of uncertainty with what that future holds. And just generally, I think that managers and anglers alike have to be open and willing to adjust actions and expectations essentially based on what the alewife population and what the lake can support. And certainly this has been the case at several times throughout the course of managing Lake Michigan's dynamic ecosystem. So the current predator-prey ratio focuses specifically on Chinook salmon and alewife, and future considerations may be to update or create population models to better understand biomass and prey consumption of several other important predator and prey species. Certainly other species seem to have somewhat more of a diverse diet than Chinook salmon. Lake trout tend to be benthic. Steelhead will come to the surface to feed. So it'll be interesting to see how these different species adjust to low alewife biomass in the lake. Certainly all these species eat alewife, so they'll all be greatly impacted by the low alewife abundance. And I think future diet studies will be important to look at overlap between these species, contribution to alewife consumption, and potential changes in how diets shift based on the current system.